About 15, 20 years ago, there was a golden age of professional boxing in Ireland where all the biggest boxers from the UK and obviously Irish boxers were able to fight at the point, and they would put on big shows, generally a Brian Peters promotion. Multiple world champions came here and fought defences of their crowns. We had Wayne McCullough fighting. We had Bernard Dunn selling out the point, but while it was still the point, and it was a brilliant moment for the sport in Ireland. And really, you can see that the inspiration that it had on the kids who came through were the generation who've done so well at Olympic Games for us. But that all stopped, and one of the reasons why it stopped is because of the involvement of organised crime with the sport in Ireland. To get to the bottom of that, I'm delighted to say we're talking about a new book. It's called Clash of the Clans, and it's from best-selling author and award-winning journalist Nicola Tallant, and it's available now in all bookshops, and we're delighted to welcome Nicola to the show. Nicola, good morning to you. How are you?
Good morning. I'm good.
This is really it is a crime story, but it's also a sports story, and that's why we feel very comfortable covering it. There hasn't been any significant professional shows put on in a long time in this country, and I think it is all traced back to the involvement of organised crime in the sports. When did you realise that this was the next subject for a book, that actually the story is so long form at this point that the only way to deal with it properly, to explain the characters and what's happened, is in book form?
Yeah, I think so. And, I had to kind of go pretty far back to explain what happened from a crime point of view and the development of the first Irish mafia. But within that and the sort of journey of discovery I was on myself in it, I think the boxing story starts around 2013 when I was in Marbella to investigate the sort of re-emergence of the Kinahan mafia after they had supposedly been shut down by Operation Shovel, which was a multi-agency assault on them by police forces across Europe. But while out there, we were sort of pointed in the direction of this small gym that had started up just outside Portabanus, and it was, they had always, sort of the criminals on the Costa had always met and used gyms and gyms as such as a meeting place. They kind of, while they like to think that they are irregular in their activities, they're actually very regular. They usually get up in the morning, head to the gym, do a bit of a workout, and then have a breakfast later, and always in the same places. But anyway, this new gym had opened, and we were told if we were looking for any of the Irish, that's where we'd find them. And on a roundabout outside Portabanus, I found myself looking down into what looked like a car park with a sign above it called MGM, and really that's where it started. And Daniel Kinahan and Matthew Macklin had just opened the gym in the months previous. It sort of just looked as if it could have been a hobby more than anything else, but you can see kind of over the next 2 years how it expands beyond anything I think that I'd ever seen before in the sport of boxing.
Why did it expand? How did it expand?
Well, it just expanded really quickly, and obviously there was obviously money in it. In the beginning in Marbella, it opened as a gym that was a non-for-profit organisation, and it was running events that were raising funds for charity, in particular a children's charity that was based there. It was appearing, Macklin and others involved in the gym were appearing in society pages out in Marbella. And, it didn't look like it was coming to anything, even though celebrities who visited the area were invited in to train. There was photographs of them put up on the social media sites. There was obviously a good marketing sort of network behind it. But around 2013 into 2014, you can see they start bringing in the big name boxers. Thomas Stalker was one of the first ones to go in from the UK. His joining of the gym made front page news in Liverpool. He joined up. Declan Geraghty was one of the first Irish boxers to join up. And you can just see them starting to very quickly sign. I think by around 2015, in that short period of about 18 months, they'd signed 100 boxers.
That's the bit where the management company becomes a big story in terms of the actual sport of boxing. Up to this point, it had kind of been a gym where people trained for fights and there was some link with a management company, but you weren't quite sure where it was going to go. At this point, it becomes clear that this is a new enterprise and a new business, and the intention of the business is to own the management rights to some very significant boxers and to grow that stable to not just tens but hundreds of boxers.
Yeah, most definitely. And they were also organising big events here in Ireland in 2014 and 2015. And there was promises of great things. And I think for the boxers that were signing up, if you go back and you look at what they had to say at the time before it kind of became maybe caustic to talk about Daniel Kinahan, they were all very openly talking about Kinahan being involved, being their manager. A lot of them were talking about not really having other opportunities, not having anywhere else to go, and finding this sort of nirvana out in Spain, that they were being paid to do what they loved to do. They were being offered accommodation. Their families were moving out. There was a lot of hope. And, they were being sold this dream, which I think they probably still are, that they would be well paid and that they'd have fights put on, and that boxing was alive and well again when MGM, later MTK, was on the scene. If you look at Paddy Barnes, the former Irish Olympic boxer, when he signed up, he actually said that there was nothing else on the table for him and he was about to lose his grant from Sports Ireland because his time was up with that. He was on a grant of about 40,000 a year, and he had a new child there, and he needed to earn money. So when MGM came knocking, it was a dream come true for him. It was a job, it was a wage. So that's what they were offering the boxers, and a lot of them, if you look at when they went out to Spain to train out there, they were staying in very luxury accommodation. They were being treated like proper sports stars. So very attractive.
There was certainly an ignorance, I think, in the public, or maybe just a lack of awareness in the public about what was going on at the start, like that 2013 to 2015 period. Was there an acceptable ignorance maybe within the boxing community as well, and those fighters, that there was an innocence almost to what the fighters were getting involved in?
I think people tried, I think people were happy to turn a blind eye more than anything else. I was writing in the book as I was going through that time period, Macklin was going to the US to fight at one point, and Daniel Kinahan and the late Gary Hutch posted photographs with him, and they were having a little send-off for him in Spain because they couldn't travel. They wouldn't be able to go with him to spectate because they wouldn't have got into the US. And what you had was this bizarre situation that on the back pages of a newspaper, you'd have a story that, Macklin was going to, chase his dreams, basically, to reignite his career. And on the front pages, you had the story that, Macklin and the mob, that they were travelling en masse. A lot of the senior members of the Irish mafia were going out with him to support him. So it was this very strange situation that really has gone on until recently, that you have sports journalists sort of, just ignoring the fact that the organised crime is very heavily involved in boxing. And obviously Kinahan was one of the founders of MGM. We've been told he's nothing to do with it now. It had changed name and it had been sold, and we've been told repeatedly that he's nothing to do with it. And yet then he comes forward and he says actually he does. He's an advisor to these very, very well-known boxers.
It's always that that line where you cover events and then covering the entourage is tricky, and I suspect that's why many of the papers were doing one story on the front and one story on the back.
Yeah, or just it was a different thing. I just think that in the sport of boxing, it seems to be sort of acceptable. Um, I've spoken to you before about Senate hearings in the US in the 80s, where you had one of John Gotti's men talking about how the mob used boxing to wash their dirty funds. And that was a very clear insight into why organised crime groups saw the sport of boxing as useful to them for many reasons. And, you know, you have a long history there in the sport with involvement of criminals, well-known criminals. And, you know, it's a sport maybe of the working classes as well. And that's maybe where it spurs from in the first place. But I just think, like, I found it myself absolutely amazing to see this sport just allow the likes of the name of Kinahan just seep into it as if it was totally normal that somebody like that would be involved. I'm not sure another sport that I can think of would have that.
So, certainly, amateur boxing has had its struggles. There's one of the the FBI's most wanted list, heavily involved with the International Amateur Boxing Association, as it was. It's because boxing is so fragmented. It's difficult for the whole sport to have. It's difficult to take it all as one. So if a promoter and a fighter are involved with somebody from organised crime, to make the fights that everybody wants to see, you sometimes have to get in bed with unsavoury characters. And we've seen this, again, throughout history in the past, where the public demands the fight and there's so much money to be made that everybody holds their nose and pays the money and watches the fight. So it's kind of like everybody is complicit.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the biggest problem there is for the big corporates, and you know, we saw that in the recent past there when Tyson Fury came out and name-checked Kinahan, and you know, that went on to create world headlines, and Panorama documentary earlier this year, which detailed his involvement in the sport. It's the corporate structures like Sky and other companies like that that have the bigger problem than the ordinary punter who's going to put their hand in their pocket and pay to view. You don't have anyone much to answer to. You know, you want to see the fight, that's the beginning and the end of it. But the big business that are in bed with them and taking the money and you know, paying out money to groupings that are linked to organised crime, they really are the ones that have the issue, I think.
Do you find then that when it comes to the coverage that there is a difference as a result of the events of earlier this year, Nicola, between maybe the Irish media coverage and the international media coverage, where the international coverage is now at a place where maybe the Irish coverage was in 2015, or that fight in the US that you allude to there, whatever it was, 7 years ago, 6 years ago at this point?
Yeah. I mean, I think that Panorama documentary did a lot to raise awareness of it. And, you know, it's hard to tell. There's an awful lot of online activity and awareness of it. But, you know, I'd still be reading about you know, bouts that are still desired to be put on, and no mention of the background and the people involved. So it is quite extraordinary. Now, from a crime point of view, the investigations are continuing into the Kinahan organisation, and you know, there might be developments in that over the coming 12 months. We've seen a lot of developments recently in relation to some of the investigations that are ongoing here. So it is kind of the overall plan to dismantle completely that mob is in its final stages now. And I think there's an end in sight. So it'll be interesting to see how that will be handled. And, you know, from a boxing point of view, will that be ignored as well? You know, and does the show go on no matter what?
Yeah, I'd say yes is the answer to that. I'd say history will teach us that, yeah. And actually, if there was a dismantling of that operation, boxing would go, well, all's well that ends well. You know, that's
Exactly.
it's almost a get out of jail in some respects, if you excuse my mixed metaphors. Can you take us back to there's a hinge point, I think, in certainly the public's awareness of the involvement of organised crime and boxing, and that's the Regency Hotel, where the public is awakened to the fact that, like, because there had been a number of events, as you say, before that, where there'd be a weigh-in, we'd cover them, we'd go, the fights would be on, sometimes they would be big enough to draw media attention, sometimes they wouldn't, but it was certainly felt like there was the genesis of a new boxing industry was here. And then, like, I remember in the build-up to that going, is this something that we need staff? Are the fights big enough? Probably not. No need to send anybody to this. And in retrospect, pretty glad we didn't send anybody on the day, because it was obviously a horrific scene. Like, it has become kind of a little bit, in how we speak about it, a bit cartoonish because of the video that comes out afterwards. But actually, you know, there's murder in a hotel in a city where this is not what we've come to expect from day-to-day life. It's a really horrific moment in Irish society that we've sometimes, I think, it feels like we forget about that.
It's funny you should say that about not sending people to cover, because actually we were, as a news reporting team covering crime, we were attending a lot of these weigh-ins in advance of the Regency. We were there, not probably, you know, visibly. We were there in the background and outside in surveillance vans for the gathering of that intelligence as regards what's going on within the mob, because you can get, in the same way as investigators will get intelligence from watching who's with who arrives with who, sometimes even the positioning of people in a car, when you see who's the driver, who's in the front seat, who's in the back seat, all these things go to make up, it's like a tapestry of what's happening. And obviously in the run-up to that Regency, we had been doing a lot of work on this fallout that had started within the Kinahan organised crime group. Really, I think the shooting of Jamie Moore in Daniel Kinahan's garden in Spain in 2014 was the proper start of it, as such, as we realised there was something going on. Jamie Moore was a coach, and he was out working with Macklin at the time, and he had been out for a night, came back to this beautiful gated villa late and let himself in the gate and was walking up towards the house when he would later describe himself in an interview. He was approached by a shadowy figure. He initially thought it was a joke when he saw him, because the Irish crew out there and within the gym were very friendly, and they had they obviously used to play tricks on one another, so he initially thought it was a joke, but then he saw the flash of gunfire and felt the pain, and he was shot and left pretty much to die in the garden. He had very little juice left on his phone. Daniel Kinahan and Gary Hutch, who would later be murdered, were inside the house, but it was so vast that they couldn't hear him. So he eventually managed to get on a 911 call and used his phone to tell the emergency services where he was. Now, that attack at the time was blamed by the Kinahan Mafia publicly as being, a fallout with the Russians or something like that. But actually what was going on was a fallout within the group. And that's what resulted in the Regency Hotel attack. Gary Hutch was blamed on that shooting. He disappeared to Amsterdam, where he was kidnapped. He escaped like a scene out of The Bourne Identity. He returned to Ireland. His uncle stepped in, the godfather of the family, and a deal was supposedly done. But the deal was reneged on when Hutch was murdered in Spain in September 2015, and the kickback from that was the Regency Hotel. And
that's the potted history essentially of the Hutch versus Kinahan feud that claimed so many lives in Dublin inner city over the period of about 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Look, this attack on the the Regency Hotel was a murder attempt on Daniel Kinahan. David Byrne was tragically murdered, and he was kind of, he was unfortunate. He was there, but he wasn't the target. Daniel Kinahan was the target, and he knew he was the target. He escaped, and, the retribution for that, for attacking somebody who was essentially the head of that mob, came fast and furious. And 18 to 20 people's murders have been linked to the feud. Most of them are on the side of the Hutch faction, the murder victims. There was only maybe one, I think, which would have been seen as being a Kinahan associate was killed. And all that's happened since, we have 60 members of certainly associates of the mob behind bars. A lot of it has been taken down. The powerhouse here in Ireland is gone, and in the UK, that has all been dismantled, and the final phase is ongoing. But it's all so deeply embedded in boxing, every bit of it, and even from before all these big events happened, boxing has been at the heart and soul of the Irish mafia. And it's Kinahan, I've described him before as a bit of a Pablo Escobar character, in that Escobar loved football and bought the football team. Kinahan absolutely adores boxing, and that's his passion in life, and it always has been his passion. He has very high ambitions for himself within that sport.
Nicola, from your own perspective, there are a number of moments peppered throughout the book that an ordinary journalist would look at and say, Christ, those are incredible / awful situations to be in. You mentioned there that the surveillance around the Regency that day. When you're writing this book, when you're compiling all those moments and getting them together, are you looking back and thinking, God, I have seen quite some things. I've been in some situations myself, even just as a reporter on this beat.
Yeah, I suppose so, actually. And the way I wrote it was to kind of put a bit of myself into it as well, maybe to give people a little bit of intimacy with the story and a bit of insight into the work of a crime journalist, because it seems to be, everyone seems to be interested in it, where for me it's an ordinary job. But when I started to put together the stuff that had gone on and the journey of discovery that I have been on myself, really, to understand this, what this is and where it came from as well, because that's important, because, criminals don't just come out of thin air. They come from marginalised places that society creates. So, it's all our fault, this. It's not just them and us. But yeah, there was a couple of hairy moments when I look back, or when I put them together, they look worse really than when they're separated. There's some bit of black humour as well involved in covering this stuff. And certainly I've met some interesting characters along the way as well. But I think it just gives a little bit of an intimacy with the story for readers.
From your own perspective, was there a moment that was the most hairy, that was the one that maybe had you thinking twice about what you were doing, or does that never come into your head?
Oh God, it does, yeah. Probably some of the hairy moments aren't in the book, but some of them are. But certainly when we were spotted, or I was spotted in Portabanus by one of the Kinahan heavies, while as we were actually on an investigation and had photographed Christy Kinahan Sr. in the port. It was a stupid idea to go for a drink, but we were kind of feeling that we were the cats that got the cream when we photographed him that night. But, that was a moment where it was alert and calm that got us out of that situation. I was recognised in the bar. One of my team spotted the guy, recognising me, basically watching me, and followed him into a bathroom where he heard him on the phone calling for backup. And, there was something going to happen that night, but we were able to move and separate and get out of there. But I suppose all these things how you learn to behave in the job. You learn to be quite alert, always watching your back, especially when working, you know. So, and, you know, continue to learn as we continue to work in, you know, you're working, I suppose, in a dangerous enough environment at times.
And the story keeps getting bigger and bigger, like with the elevation of the fighters that Daniel Kinahan is connected to reaching the world heavyweight title. Essentially, we've seen, as you said, Tyson Fury making global news by mentioning the fact that Daniel Kinahan was giving him advice. In your view, how involved is Kinahan at the moment with the biggest fights that we're seeing in the world? Because the MTK fighters are still fighting for world titles. The Canelo versus Billy Joe Saunders, Fury versus Wilder, the trilogy is, you know, without the added story, one of the most interesting fights that we've had in a long period of time. This rivalry is a proper bona fide rivalry in the heavyweight division, which is like the whole world stops to watch this. Mm-hmm. How involved do you think at the moment Daniel Kinahan is with Fury and those fighters and with MTK?
You know, I think he's as involved as we were told he was, which is right in there. He's the power broker, and we have been told that by him and by you know, others within the MTK company, although they insist that he's not being paid, or there's no money basically caught up in it, and he doesn't actually have a job, he doesn't have a role. They seem to be managing to get around it all by calling him an advisor. But, you know, Daniel Kinahan is hugely invested in boxing, absolutely hugely invested in boxing. And I suppose you can't say that without pointing out that he has been, or is believed to have been, at the very top of a European super cocaine cartel made up of the Irish, the Italian Camorra Mafia, the Bosnian Tito and Dino grouping, and the Makra Mafia, which are the Dutch Moroccans, many of whom are on trial, and one of whom is actually threatening the Prime Minister of the Netherlands at the moment. He's got security. So he's made millions, possibly billions, from flooding Europe with cocaine. So, you know, he's heavily invested in his hobby, his sport, his passion of boxing. And, you know, there's no question, there's no denying it. He's told us that himself. So I have no reason to believe that he's in any way separated from that. Now, look, you know, we'll see what happens with Daniel Kinahan over the coming months, but contacts of mine who would be very close to him and within his circle and moving within those boxing circles would tell me that a lot of people feel they can't disentangle themselves from Kinahan, and that a lot of people, both inside and outside boxing, would feel almost relief if he was arrested, because it would be an end of sorts to it. I think a lot of people are frightened of him, terrified of what he is and what he can do, and they have just got themselves too heavily involved with him, and there's no way out.
I think that's an important point when people criticise the boxers, particularly the young boxers, who actually, as you talked about earlier on, having no real choice. There's no option or opportunity for them, and somebody comes and offers them an opportunity. And it's not just an opportunity the way a normal job opportunity comes. If you say no, you're saying no to some pretty difficult people to say no to. I think that's kind of an underrated part of the story.
Oh, most definitely. And there's all sorts of stories about people being threatened and being advised that, you know, you really should say yes. And I have absolutely no doubt to, you know, I believe that 100% because I know exactly how they operate. And somebody like Daniel Kinahan will always get what he wants. And very few people will stand up to him. And that's just the way things are. And the power that people within the criminal underworld hold over others. So I think that there's a lot of people out there. Look, in the end of the day, the boxers want to feed their families. They want a wage. It's what they do for a living. If I was in their shoes, I'd probably be saying yes to the job as well. And I don't think there's any blame to be put on them. I think that, money corrupts, and it also feeds greed, and all of us have it in us to be greedy and to want more and more. And I think, and I've seen it so much within criminal circles that, you see people and they're still involved and they have more money than they'll ever be able to spend in their life. And yet they just keep doing more and more, crimes basically, and gathering more. Same could be said in the corporate world though. And with all of this, the same could be said in the corporate world. There are people like Daniel Kinahan, and there's others who are in the boardroom in the same way that they're, in the realms of gangland. It is a personality. It's a kind of a narcissistic personality that succeeds, because, like, realistically, if you don't have any empathy, you'll probably do better than if you do. But yeah, I think the boxers aren't to blame. They're just taking a wage. But there's people higher up that would be very happy to see this conclude, and to basically, I suppose, have the guards make this business decision for them to separate them from Kinahan.
Yeah, no doubt. Nicola Tallant, great stuff. Thanks a million for joining us. The new book is out. It's called Clash of the Clans. You can get it in all good bookshops now. I should, of course, remind you that Daniel Kinahan has no criminal convictions. He was named in the High Court in 2018 as a senior figure in organised crime on an international scale.